All right, Econ friends. So we've now covered an overview, introduction to market failure, and then we discussed externalities and then public goods. This will be our last formal discussion on this. And in this video, we're going to be discussing the market failure known as asymmetric information, which is a very fancy way in economics of saying a lack of information or incomplete information. Just by way of context, this has always been very important in market failure theory, but especially recently with the jump in technology and social media, the idea of information and the economics of information has really grown in prominence. So in this video, we're going to discuss and kind of flesh out our final market failure, asymmetric information. Asymmetric information refers to situations where one party to an exchange, either the buyer or the seller, has significantly better information than the other. Up until now, when we've been discussing competitive markets and the voluntary exchange, there's been an underlying assumption that both buyers and sellers have information, that they have roughly equal information, so they can make informed decisions around their incentives, okay? Asymmetric information, a lack of information, is considered a market failure because when there is a lack of information, when the two parties to a trade, the buyer and the seller, are not entering the exchange equally armed with info, there could be trade breakdowns. Those are market failures, okay? So let's go through this in a step-by-step way. In some cases, it's important to point out that the buyer is less informed than the seller. So sometimes the asymmetric information can hurt the buyer. Think about if you're buying a used car, or if you're a boss hiring a new employer, or if you're a patient being advised or prescribed medical care, drugs or treatments or surgeries for a condition. Okay, you have a massive information disadvantage. Think about the used car example. Unless you're a trained mechanic, you can't look at a car and be, oh, that was well taken care of. You don't know. So the seller of the used car has a level of information, because he or she knows how they handled it and how they maintained it, that you don't have. And that's going to harm you. It's going to make you less willing to buy the car and maybe not pay full market price. Okay? Think about the case of hiring a new employee. You know, suppose that, that should be a new employee, apologies. Suppose that you're a boss and you're interviewing a worker. You really don't know what that worker is really about. They may be great in an interview. They may be a fantastic worker. They may not. They may be, you know, lazy, shifty, dishonest. You don't know this. So you're making the decision to hire, meaning consume labor, not knowing all the facts. And clearly, if you're going in to see a doctor and the doctor's prescribing you, you know, some advanced medical treatment, recommending a surgery, giving you a prescription drug, I mean, you're not a trained medical professional. You're going to have no idea as to both the impacts and the potential side effects of these treatments or drugs. So you as the buyer sometimes are going to have less information than the seller. And you can imagine that that's going to really impact your decision to enter that market as openly as if you had information. In other markets, however, the seller is less informed than the person who is buying. This is especially true in lending markets and in insurance markets, which have always troubled economics, in large part because imagine that you are going to get a loan. You're going to go ask a bank for a loan, or you're going to go and buy an insurance policy. You as the buyer, because you're buying the loan or you're buying the insurance, you have an information advantage over the insurance company or the bank. They don't know your ability to repay the loan truly. The insurance companies don't know your entire health history. Insurance companies also don't know the level of risk that you take. So you're going to have a lot of information that would be helpful to the decision. And unless you voluntarily share it with the bank or with the insurance company, the seller, in this case, the bank that's selling you a loan, or the insurance company that's selling you the policy, they're going to have a major disadvantage. Okay, all of these put together give us the idea of asymmetric information, and we conclude that it's a market failure because at its core, a lack of good information can prevent mutually beneficial trades from occurring. And we know from our talks on efficiency that whenever a mutually beneficial trade does not occur, we're going to be talking about some sort of dead weight loss. But again, at its core, the market is designed to allocate scarce resources and maximize win-win interactions. In cases where there are extreme asymmetric information hassles, some trades that otherwise would have occurred won't, okay? When we talk about asymmetric information, there's a few specific types. One of those is what we're going to call adverse selection. Adverse selection is a specific class or a specific category of information failures, okay? Adverse selection is defined as the tendency of asymmetric information to result in a less desirable selection of goods or services, and as we would predict, a deadweight loss for the market. Okay, so again, adverse selection, a specific class of information failures, is a tendency whenever there's asymmetric information for a market to generate less desirable goods and services, and therefore deadweight losses. There's a couple of examples historically used. Let's take the market for used cars. And let's just say, to keep this very simple, that there's two types of used cars. There's lemons and there's plums. A lemon is a poorly maintained used car. So we're going to say that lemons are overall bad quality, and a plum is overall good quality. Okay, so again, a market for used cars. You're going to go out looking for a used car, got to get around. Okay, you see the market for this particular thing that you want. Within that market, there's going to be some of those used cars that are lemons, poorly maintained, lots of underlying structural issues, probably not a good buy. And there's going to be plums, really well maintained, great bargain, just what you need. But notice that unless you're a trained mechanic or you're going to go get one, like a friend to go look at the car for you, you yourself don't have the knowledge to know, am I looking at a lemon or am I looking at a plum? Note that in a market, if left alone, there would be a low demand for lemons, leading to a very low price being paid and hopefully a low quantity being sold. But there would be a high demand for plums, generating a higher price for those good cars and hopefully putting on the market more of those good cars. So notice again the idea that if there were plenty of information, the market would clearly price lemons really low because they're crappy and price plums higher because they're of better quality. And those prices would be very clear signals that you can make the right decision. But because you as the buyer, you don't have no information. You don't know, is this car a lemon or a plum? You're going to automatically reduce your demand. So the demand for the plums when there's asymmetric information is going to fall. And in fact, you will be right around the same price for the plums as the lemons. And that's rational from your part because you don't know if the car is good or not. So with asymmetric information, there's effectively a shift to the left of your demand curve for the good cars. That's going to drop the price of those good cars and put it close to par with the price for the lemons. That's rational for you. Of course, now put yourself in the position of a car owner who owns a plum. He's going to say, I've taken great care of this car. I've maintained it. I've changed the oil. I've never crashed it. It's always been washed. It's in great condition. I expect $10,000 for this. And if the market is only $6,000, the rational response of the car seller is to pull that car off the market. In other words, there should have been this many plums put on the market. We're going to call that the ideal amount. But instead, because of the artificial low price, there's going to be less. In other words, there's going to be a lack of trades. And as you know by now, my friends, the gap between what should have been bought and sold and what is actually bought and sold, that gap is a dead weight loss. So society and the market economy and social welfare gets hurt when people don't have information. Adverse selection can do that. Here's another example, just to kind of show it. Let's say in this one, we're no longer analyzing used cars. We're analyzing insurance markets. You are going to demand insurance because you want to have it. Notice that if insurance companies who sell you the policies had good information, they would have this supply curve here. And that would lead to insurance policies, I don't know, maybe costing $10,000 a year. And you would have this amount of actual policies bought and sold. You'd have massive economic surplus. It'd be very good. But again, because sellers, in this case, insurance company, they don't have information on you. They don't know if you're going to go and do risky things. They don't know if you have an underlying history of disease. They don't know if there are behaviors that you exhibit that you're not telling them about. And because of this, when they have incomplete or asymmetric information, they're going to supply less. You're going to see this move to a lower supply curve because of information asymmetries. And as we know, that's going to lead to a new equilibrium. And as you guessed it, we're going to see higher prices in insurance markets. And critically, we're going to see fewer people buying and selling insurance. And as you know, whenever you have an artificially low amount, dead weight loss. This is one of the major problems that really plagues insurance markets. The idea that without proper information, insurance companies are less incentivized to sell policies. And if they don't know all the facts, they're going to react predictably by raising prices for everybody, even people who are forthright, healthy, non-risky behavior taking, etc. So we all have to pay slightly higher insurance prices because of this adverse selection. We've seen how now adverse selection can cause dead weight losses. In extreme cases, adverse selection can completely actually eliminate the market for a product. And that's truly a market failure because these products are important and beneficial. If adverse selection is not curtailed, we can actually see an entire market eliminated. And that's a massive market failure, okay? The second type of situation, we've covered adverse selection, is this situation known as moral hazard. Moral hazard refers to a situation in which there is an increased tendency to take risks because some of the potential cost of that risky behavior will be paid by others. okay? Moral hazard, again, occurs anytime if you take a risky behavior and that risky behavior burns you, a part of the cost of that behavior is paid by others. We see this very, very often in insurance markets. If you know that you crash your car and you only have to pay a little bit and the insurance company is going to pay more, you're going to have a perverse incentive to drive slightly riskier because you're not on the hook for the full risk that you entail. We also see this in some financial markets. Imagine a situation where if a bank takes risky financial behaviors, imagine if those risky behaviors that the bank takes generate high profits. The bank keeps all those profits, right? But imagine if those risky behaviors lead the bank to go bankrupt. Oftentimes, the federal government steps in to bail out the bank. This is one of the biggest critiques that some economists have about bailouts. They say, no, 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 the government can't bail out troubled firms. Because once the government starts bailing out firms, we're going to have moral hazard. And we predict in economics that under the idea of moral hazard, if the government, like an insurance company, is going to be bailing out companies that take risky actions and get burned for them, the companies are going to say, wait a minute, I'm going to take a risky action. If I benefit, I keep all the profit. If I fail, the government bails me out. We predict that these banks, for example, would take much higher risk. And the research shows that they do. And even a basic idea of economic incentives, that should make sense to you. If you're going to keep all the benefits but be able to push all the cost, you're going to take more risky behavior. Okay, we call that moral hazard. Moral hazard is especially harmful in insurance markets and other markets with asymmetric information. The insurance company doesn't know once you have insurance how you will now behave. Because they don't have that information, they predictably have to price in extremely risky behavior into your policy. And as a result, as with adverse selection, many of us pay artificially high rates on insurance. We pay a much higher premium than we have to pay, in large part because the insurance company has to cover moral hazard risk. Okay, so we have this idea that information is really important for the functioning of markets. It's right up there with property rights as being an integral component of well-functioning markets, okay? We know that we can have a series of information failures that can affect buyer side or seller side. We know that those are generally going to lead to less of a product being bought and sold, and therefore a dead weight loss, or an excessively high price to account for adverse selection and moral hazard. All of those together constitute market failure because the markets in these cases are not producing the right price and the right amount of product, okay? Now that we know what those asymmetric information problems are, we have to ask, what are the policy options to mitigate them? And as always, we return to the role of government because one way that a market can handle this is that governments can simply legislate. They can pass laws that require the disclosure of appropriate information to minimize these problems. When you go to get a loan or a student loan, for example, government rules dictate that the bank must give you in really bold writing what the actual rate is, and they must tell you all the different fees. When you go to get an insurance policy or apply for a home mortgage, the government requires that you give correct information, and you have to sign under a penalty of perjury that the info that you reported is actually correct. Okay? In even a more simple case, if you live in LA County and you want to go to a restaurant and you want to have an idea if you're going to get E. coli or not, government requires in LA County that restaurants put that letter grade in the window. You never thought about that, but it's ultimately a government attempt to require information disclosure so that consumers, in this case, people who want to eat at a restaurant, can make an informed decision. Oh, that place has an A, that place has a C. Yeah, I'm not going to go there. The government knows that we can't see what's going on in the kitchen, so they require restaurants to disclose information. It's all rooted in the idea of minimizing and getting rid of these information asymmetries to allow markets to function better. So we can see governmental intervention. Adverse selection, there's a couple of creative ways that firms can handle this. Specifically, adverse selection situations can be countered via what's known as screening and what's known as signaling. Screening occurs when a company does what it has to do to acquire reliable information about a product. So for example, if you go to apply for a health insurance policy, you may have to get a physical. They're going to want to make sure that you're relatively healthy, that you don't drink to excess, that you don't use drugs. You're going to have to go and be screened. If you go and apply for a loan, the lending company is going to look at your credit score. That's a way to screen you. Are you a good credit risk or are you not? Do you have a stable payment history or are you shaky financially? Okay, so screening is one way that we can counter this. Signaling is another way. People or firms can send signals to demonstrate their ability to be perceived as lower risk, potentially higher status. Some of the best signaling, as we discussed, is you guys going to get your bachelor's degree. I asked the question of you guys before, why do you want a BA? What if you're going into an industry where you don't necessarily need a full BA, you could take 3 or 4 online classes? Well, now maybe you see that ultimately you getting your BA is sending a signal to any future boss and maybe a potential future mate that, hey, you're not a bad risk. You're intelligent, you're hardworking, you've got the tenacity to get through a long 4-year program of rigorous but boring economics, for example, and therefore you are a capable person who should be hired or dated. Okay, signaling. So we can minimize some adverse selection situations through screening mechanisms or signaling mechanisms. Next time you take a look at some of those things in the real world that have confused you, ask yourself, wait a minute, when people engage in that, are they being screened or are they signaling? Once you know how to look for these things, you'll see screening and signaling everywhere because information is so important in a modern economy, okay? When it comes to insurance markets, typically private insurers have found multiple ways to counter moral hazard. How do they do it? Well, number one, they may require high deductibles. The deductible is the amount that you have to pay before your insurance company kicks in. By having a higher deductible, by putting you on the hook for more if you get into an accident, an insurance company is finding a way to signal how risk averse or risk taking you are. If you say to the insurance company, I'll absolutely pay a higher deductible, you are signaling that you're confident that you're not going to be a high risk factor. And as a result, oftentimes, insurance companies will reward people who pay higher deductibles with lower insurance rates because the people signal, I'm a good bet. You can imagine that somebody who says, I want a very, very low deductible. That can be a signal to an insurance company that this person might get into more accidents, might need more doctor's visits, might cause a little bit more havoc. And if you want a low deductible, the insurance company will make you pay a higher rate. So insurance companies can use deductibles They can also have high co-payments. A co-payment, like a deductible, they're similar, related. A co-payment is how much of an actual procedure you have to pay along with your insurance company. Notice that the use of deductibles and co-payments is a way for an insurance company to try to align your incentives with theirs and to share information. It's very clever. You also have screening mechanisms, as we've discussed. And another thing that insurance companies use in insurance markets, it's what's known as experience rating. Experience rating is ultimately when an insurance company will look back at your insurance history and simply say, are you the type of customer who files a lot of claims and cost the insurance company a lot of money, or are you not? And they'll oftentimes use experience rating criteria to set your insurance price, okay? I bring all this up because up here, we discussed the idea that government has a role to play in this market failure. But there's also private solutions when companies and markets themselves can use clever things like signal mechanisms, screening mechanisms, deductible and copay mechanisms to try to get information. Of course, especially in insurance markets, since there's always going to be adverse selection and moral hazard, we oftentimes find many countries where the governments pass mandated insurance laws, where the government simply says, you have to have insurance. In California, if you drive, you have to have car insurance. You don't have a choice. Why does the government do that? Well, they believe that by mandating universal car insurance in California, they can eliminate adverse selection because everybody has to be in the market. So anyway, to wrap it up, we know what asymmetric information is. We know its impact on a market. We know how to kind of think through adverse selection and moral hazard. But much like we have with public goods, with externalities, we have a potential for either government-based solutions, which are common, but also innovative uses of technology and information for private or market-based solutions. And again, it's a bit of a paradox to think that there could be a market-based solution to a market failure. But if you can think in a clever way and really understand the economics of the situation, you can achieve that, as insurance companies have done. Okay? With this, my friends, we are now done with our discussion of market failure. Great job, and I'll see you next time.